Hey guys, welcome to lesson 3 this week, hour 3. So the first thing I want you to do straight away is I want you to try and do this without notes, okay? Because the point is that you should have really been going over what we've done already. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to try and, without notes, highlight 10 things from last lesson. Okay, and that can be anything. It can be the names of directors that we looked at. It can be certain key points about the silent film era. It can be certain key points about key silent films. It could be perhaps something about modernism and that wider cultural, social, political movement of modernism, where it came from, why it emerged, etc. Or it could be something to do with German Expressionism. We just started to look at German Expressionism, and I'd gone through a kind of number of different key German Expressionist texts. So maybe it could be the names of some of them. I don't care what it is. I want to see if you can remember 10 things from last lesson. Okay, so get those 10 things down. Press pause. We'll have a brief intermission, and I'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Okay, 10 minutes. Write your 10 things down. See you back here in 10. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. Just that's for you, okay? That's for you to recap. It's for you to kind of get to grips with everything that we've done, and it's also for me to make sure that you're aware you should be going through these lessons. Just doing the lesson is not enough. You should do it, take time out, take a day or so, go back to it and recap and see what you can remember and go back through those notes again. It's really important, okay? So thank you for doing that. We're going to do a big chunk now of context in relation to German Expressionism, and I hope some of you will know quite a lot of this from the homework that I set you over half term. And that was the point, that you would be up to speed a little bit, and that the stuff we talk about now would seem a little easier and more accessible. But maybe I'll go into it in a little bit more detail perhaps, or maybe you've got loads of detail in your scrapbooks. I know a lot of you did from the ones that I've had a look through, which is all of them, and they're great. So I want to go through the Weimar Republic. I want to talk a little bit about the Expressionist movement in general, and then we will kind of like have a look at German Expressionism specifically, and that'll be take us through the rest of the lesson. Okay. So remember to be making notes, not just off the PowerPoints here, but of the stuff I'm saying as well. Exactly as class. Try as much as you can to recreate the classroom experience as you can, which is usually probably trying to write a bunch of stuff down whilst I just, go off on weird tangents about cinema. That's fine though, right? So let's start with the Weimar Republic. So if you go onto the PowerPoint, the Silent Cinema and German Expressionism PowerPoint, which I've got here, which is why occasionally I'll go down there, the Weimar Republic, slide 15, okay? So let's talk through them and click through them as we go, okay? So first of all, we can see the First World War, okay, was the first modern war, okay? It was a war that was fought in a modern way with modern technology and equipment and machinery, okay? So it's a very modern war, the first modern war in that sense, okay? Now Germany lost, and Germany as a nation afterwards were destroyed. They were destroyed economically, psychologically, emotionally. It was a complete annihilation of German identity. The loss was devastating to them, and obviously, if you're studying history or you know history, you know far more about it than this. What I'm doing here is a very brief overview so that we understand where this movement comes from. But it's very important for us to know the emotional or psychological state of the nation after their loss in the First World War, and it was a very precarious situation. They were destroyed, okay, in every way you could imagine, okay. The German state at this point was known as the Weimar Republic, and after the war, in this kind of new terrifying world, this world of economic collapse and psychological collapse and emotional collapse, we also had inflation, we had anarchy, we had desperation, okay. It was a very difficult place to be. Not unlike where we are now in America, especially at the moment. Interesting parallels. Now, out of this anarchy and this chaos and this psychological, emotional devastation of the nation, okay, an artistic movement emerged. And this artistic movement's aim was to try and make some sense out of this chaos. It was to try and make some sense of the horror of the war, okay, why they were in, why the war had happened, the atrocities and horrors that had been committed on behalf of this war, and then the aftermath. Because not only had those atrocities been committed, but they'd been committed in absolute vain. The Germans lost, and it was a devastation. So this artistic movement started to emerge from this chaos. What we see quite often when you look back at film movements, I think we've already mentioned Italian neorealism, which came out of the Second World War, is at moments of great chaos and collapse in nations, art, a new type of art is often born out of it, okay? And it makes you wonder what art we're going to see after the moment that we're in now. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how artists in all mediums reflect that. I think it's so important for us to study. Art is not frivolous. It is not just entertainment. It is making sense of the world. Okay, you must think of it that way. It's so important what we're studying, and it incorporates that element of history as well, because we're also trying to kind of figure out, well, you know, history. Can we learn from our mistakes? Is there a way to process what we've been through, what we've experienced? And art is a way of doing that. So art is tremendously significant for us in that sense. My PowerPoint's just died. Give me a second. Okay. So this artistic movement was Expressionism. Now, Expressionism had been around in other art mediums since about the start of the 20th century. Okay, this now after the war was cinema starting to emerge as an expressionist art form as well and become part of this movement. Okay. Expressionism is part of modernism, okay, so it's part of that wider context. So we've talked about modernism as an entire Western movement after the war. Now we're focused specifically on Germany and their response. So it's all, the big umbrella term here is modernism, okay? We're now looking at Germany's version of this, Germany's response to the war, to the wider modernist movement, okay? And it was this Expressionism. One way to define Expressionism is it featured a subjective, heightened view of the world. So that was the key defining feature of it. Everything was heightened, everything was exaggerated, everything was kind of almost grotesque. So they would take these very real themes, ideas, concerns, and then turn them into these grotesque, heightened, fantastical versions of those things. Everything subjective. It wasn't about observing objectively and getting down what you see. It was about looking at the world around you and then making it bigger, making it more intense. In that sense, that was Expressionism, really. That's the defining view of it. And these post-war artists who were the part of the Expressionist movement were very, very influenced by our old friend Sigmund Freud and his work on the unconscious and the subconscious, because his work in a way was heightened. It was taking these things that we did, these very real things that we did, and then kind of thinking, why do we do them? And he would ascribe, he would use Greek mythology and all these different things to kind of go, this is why we do it. And it seemed quite grotesque and it seemed quite exaggerated, and so and it was to do with the subconscious, so it was very subjective. And I think that's why these German expressionist artists were really kind of keen to look at that. Okay, so that's slide 15. Let's go ahead to slide 16. Okay, so slide 16, the expressionist movement in general then, okay? So the expressionist movement in general. Some definitions on that slide, on slide 16, that I want you to write down verbatim if you can. You could use these in an exam, certainly at the top of an exam when you're trying to define what expressionism is. So first one there, art wherein forms derived from nature are distorted or exaggerated and colours are intensified for emotive or expressive purposes. Okay, so that links back to what we've just been saying about this subjective, heightened view of the world. Okay, and the second definition there, a symbolic or abstract representation of reality, a subjective, heightened view of the world. So symbolic or abstract, we're not dealing with realism. This is not social realism. This is not an attempt. So if you look at Italy's way of dealing with the horrors of the Second World War was to turn to social realism. We must document things exactly as they are. We have a moral duty to document things exactly as they are. German expressionism and the expressionist movement was the absolute opposite of that, although the intention was the same. You're coming out of a war, you're coming out of mass turmoil and chaos and collapse, and you're asking yourself as an artist, how do I make sense of this? And for the Germans, it was not to just reflect back reality. It was to take that reality and turn it into a grotesque, abstract, symbolic version of it. Okay, so that you could try and figure it out that way. Two very different ways of essentially trying to achieve the same goal, which I think is massively interesting. Okay, so a couple of other key expressionists, not in cinema, because I'm just talking about the wider expressionist movement now, and you can see this on slide 16. Ernst Toller, a playwright, he wrote a very famous play, Transformation, which focused massively on the horror of war, okay, on the war. Thomas Mann, who was a writer, and he was very interested in Germany's failure as a society. Why had Germany failed as a society? Remember, that was a wider concern of the modernist movement, which was, we have failed. Everything we've done, all the traditional ways of doing things for the last few hundred years, they've led us to this massive catastrophe, the First World War. Therefore, we've been doing it wrong. We have failed as a culture, as a society. What can we do differently? Okay, so Thomas Mann, very much a modernist, very much part of the expressionist movement. Franz Kafka, a fantastic kind of playwright and writer and author, he was very interested in identity, the crumbling nature of identity, the way that identity was very fragile and it could crumble when placed under pressure. He wrote a famous book called Metamorphoses, which is about a kind of humble bank clerk, I think, if I remember. It's been a long time since I read it, who just very slowly one morning he wakes up and he just starts to turn into a beetle, and he's locked in his room, and it's terrifying and funny and obviously grotesque and heightened and abstract and symbolic, but it's about this very fragile man who slowly crumbles and turns into something. And again, go back to what we said about German expressionism last lesson, that this was very much about these kind of fragile men, these fragile identities who were manipulated under great pressure into doing things they didn't know what to do, and then the collapse of their identities. Who even are we anymore? And I think that was the big question Germany was asking itself after the World War. Who even are we anymore? And that was the wider question of modernism. Okay, and so that's really interesting. And then all of these artists that we've talked about so far were influenced by the Dadaists. And Dadaism was an avant-garde, kind of like very avant-garde movement where the artist would absolutely reject logic and reason and instead embrace the absurd. So that came into play here with the expressionists as well. So let's move to slide 17 finally for this little section. It's a lot of information, but we need to know this, I think, going forward. And let's look at German expressionism in cinema. So what we've looked at here, the Weimar Republic, what was going on in Germany socially, politically, culturally at the time. Then we've stepped inward a little bit. Let's look at the expressionist movement in general through art, the Dadaists and writers like Kafka and Mann. So the expressionist movement in Germany in general. Now let's go a step even further into our wheelhouse, which is German expressionism in cinema, which is what our focus is. Okay, so we've gone from right out here and now we're kind of at cinema and looking at German expressionism in cinema. So that's slide 17. So let's go through that and then we'll take a quick pause for a task, okay? So German expressionism in cinema. One of the things you have to remember is that film in general is still a baby, okay? We're still in the 20 years in, 15 years in, Okay, this is an art form that's only just emerged. So it's still in its infancy, it's still a new art form, okay? And already there'd been a split in terms of the way that people thought about cinema, okay? Even at this early stage of cinema. On one side, you have the Lumiere brothers, okay? The Lumiere brothers were extremely realist in what they wanted to do. They were committed to realist depictions of actual life. Okay, so the Lumiere brothers would set their camera up and they would film in a wide shot, life happening. And then they would show that to people. People would pay and see that, and they would really enjoy seeing themselves reflected back on the screen. And the Lumiere brothers really felt like that was cinema. It had that kind of obligation to kind of reflect itself, reflect life back to us in the most realistic way possible. And then on the other hand, you had Georges Méliès, okay? Georges Méliès, a French director, and he was making these kind of heightened, magical, kind of special effects driven fantasy films. And we are going to look a little bit at these two in more detail, but for now that's all you need to know. You may have seen the film Hugo by Scorsese, which is all about Georges Méliès and the emergence of his cinema, this fantastical heightened cinema. So you can see you've got two schools of thought in cinema at this time. The Lumiere brothers and their realism, and Georges Méliès and his kind of fantastical, abstract nature. Okay, two very different ways of looking at things and how cinema should work. Now, initially, German cinema, after the war, turned to horror as its source material. And it doesn't make, it's not going to cause much surprise, that is it, that it turned to horror because of the time it was going through. It was the aftershock of the First World War, the terror and horror and collapse it was going through. Horror seemed most appropriate to them. It felt like that's where their brains were at that point, the psyche, the German psyche. The filmmakers who were using horror as their source material were really influenced by Freud and his writing on the subconscious, really influenced by Mann and Toller, who we briefly mentioned before. And so, again, no surprise, this cinema that they made became very expressionistic and part of the expressionist movement. It was heightened, it was abstract, it was symbolic, okay? It was exaggerated. This all mixed together and we get really one of the first ever film movements, which is German Expressionism, okay? Which is our focus for this topic. Hollywood, over here, is still kind of finding its feet. You know, it's still, how do we do this? How do we put this together? You've got W. Griffith, you've got Buster Keaton, Chaplin, trying to kind of put film together, make sense of it. Germany, they just ran with this. Once German Expressionism had kind of took hold, German cinema became the most exciting cinema in the world at this point. They were the world leaders in cinema after the World War, okay? They just had this, kind of thing to get out there. They were full of turmoil and angst, and there were these exciting artists coming through, and it all mixed together and it made the most exciting cinema you could imagine. And boundaries were being pushed all the time, specifically in terms of set design, in terms of narrative construction, in terms of lighting, in terms of cinematography, what you could do with the camera. All of these things were just being pushed and tested to the limit all the time by the German Expressionists. Okay, so that should bring us up to speed a little bit. The wider social, political, cultural context of the Weimar Republic, the Expressionist movement and how that links to modernism as a wider Western world kind of art movement, and not just an art movement in general. This is the modern world that we live in now. Expressionist art is part of that. And then German Expressionist cinema in more detail that we've just looked at. So we should know where we're up to now. So I want to ask you a question, really. The question I want you to answer now, and it doesn't matter if you don't know, okay? But have a go. What are the defining characteristics of German Expressionist cinema? What are they? Don't go on to the next slide, don't look, it's of no use for you to do that. Let's do these lessons as much as we would do. I want you to learn, I want you to push yourself and think. So if you don't know and you look at a blank page, that's okay. You don't know yet, although we've just hinted a little bit there, so maybe you can kind of take that out. And if you do know, great, get it down. 5, 6, 7 minutes, pause this, what are the defining characteristics of German Expressionist cinema? Write them down and then we'll kind of work on it from then. So take 6 or 7 minutes, pause this, I'll see you back there. Okay, so hopefully you're looking at not a blank page, you've got 2 or 3 things, but even if you are looking at a blank page, that's okay. I kind of want to talk through now more specifically things that you would associate with German Expressionism, because it's really important for us to know, because we have to be looking for them when we watch Sunrise. We have to be looking out for these things, because the question is going to ask us, what makes this an example of German Expressionism? What makes Sunrise an example? And Sunrise both is and isn't an example of German Expressionism, which is why we've done it. It makes it so interesting to write about. We've got a natural argument there, so it makes sense to do that. But it's important that you can make the argument that Sunrise is German Expressionism. And so we have to know what defines German Expressionism. That's why I want you to watch some as well. So let's go to slide 18. So slide 18 on the PowerPoint. I just want to talk you through 7 or 8 of the key characteristics of German Expressionism. Okay, so as you can see here, these are the things I've got down. First, expressionistic shadows. You can see in the background picture of Nosferatu there, the way that shadow was used in a highly exaggerated manner. And shadow makes sense, doesn't it? Because it's this idea that you've got the self and then you've got the projection of the self. It's a very Freudian idea, but certainly fits in with the idea of expressionism, of the heightened symbolic world. And what Germany was going through. You've got the self and then this grotesque abstract version of the self that is out there doing something. So when Nosferatu's creeping up the stairs, we don't see Nosferatu, we see the shadow of him. And that maybe fits in politically with what was going on with the German mindset after the First World War. We've got these kind of tilting, physically impossible sets. The sets would not work in real life. They're clearly fake, artificial, exaggerated, symbolic. There are strange right angles. They were very influenced by the work of M.C. Escher, the way that he would create these kind of impossible kind of sets and places. If you go back to the earlier PowerPoint slide where we had that image from the cabinet of Dr. Caligari where he's carrying the body up and it's kind of all these kind of strange right angles. So leading on to high angles, oblique camera angles or canted, Dutch camera angles, very much the idea the world is not right. Something is not right with the world. That was a key thing. And obviously I'm hoping you can see how these aren't just, oh, let's be abstract and strange for the sake of it. No. You can see that these things have naturally come out of this movement because it's reflecting the German psyche at the time. Something is not right with the world. That's why we get so many oblique camera angles, okay? We've got this asymmetrical cinematography, okay? Everything's just off. Nothing is quite right. Everything is just off in this world. So we get this asymmetrical composition and cinematography. We get themes like, so in terms of our themes, we get madness, identity, guilt, violence, coercion, the idea of being pushed and cajoled into something, the idea that your identity is perhaps not as strong as you thought it was, the idea that there's a tremendous guilt being carried around by people, all reflective of the German psyche at the time, their role in the atrocities of World War I, and the tremendous guilt and chaos that they felt coming out after that. It's all being made sense of in these fantastical horror narratives. So horror narratives are not real in any way, but the themes are very, very real. Okay. We get chiaroscuro lighting. We did this in our first week, I think, of film studies. The idea of very harsh contrasts between light and dark, shadow, complete darkness, and then these bright key lights. So chiaroscuro is often done by removing the backlight and the fill light and just having this strong key light and then nothing else to create these kind of like very kind of like contrasting images in terms of light. Okay, and down there at the last little thing, we've got Lotte Eisner, a writer who uses this fantastic term that I just love saying. Good name for a thrash metal band, actually, Helldunkel. And if you want to use that, use it, because that is a great name. I would go and see that band. Helldunkel. She defines this, it says there at the bottom, as a sort of twilight of the German soul, expressing itself in shadowy, enigmatic interiors or in misty, insubstantial landscapes. Beautiful. The twilight of the German soul. Oh man, beautiful. That's also, so you can have Helldunkel as your thrash metal band, and then you could have Twilight of the German Soul as your pretentious art rock band. Either one up for grabs, take it, run with it, just cut me in 50% of all future profits. At the end of slide 18, you can see that there is a kind of little a little YouTube link there, okay? I want you to, for the final part of this lesson, I want you to watch that. It's a kind of supercut of German Expressionism imagery and aesthetic and theme. And I want you to use this slide, I want you to watch the sequence, and I want you to write down as many of the things on this slide that you see in that 5-minute supercut. Get used to what German Expressionism looks like. It's the last thing I want you to do, and I want that to be ready, as well as all of this overview of your notes. Go through them for next lesson. Thanks for your attention today. See you next lesson. Cheers, lads.